This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
So in this new work, in addition to intensive lifestyle intervention, we will include some of the promising drugs that we think will likely get approved. Now, the question is if they will be cost effective for screening. There's screening and there's treatment. So there are two different things. They can be cost effective for treatment, not for screening.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dr. Stephen Harrison, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guest, hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dr. Mazen Noureddin, as they discuss the cost-effectiveness of widespread patient testing using non-invasive techniques today on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.
For all those with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 2, Episode 16 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami starts now. Well, welcome to Life After NASH Tag. Over the last 12 days, we produced 5 original episodes, ground out 4 of them in less than 12 hours per episode. I'll talk about the results of that in my back-end business chat. But today we're back to a more normal schedule episode flow. Our good friend Mazen Noureddin, a brilliant researcher, great friend of the podcast, and the guy we have had the hardest time getting to actually his technology lined up with this platform, is joining us to discuss some elements of his own work on cost effectiveness. If you recall, we heard about Mazen on the podcast long before we met him when Donna Cryer raved about his work as her co-presenter on last autumn's Global Liver Institute Beyond the Biopsy tour. This week, we're not going to talk a bunch about Beyond the Biopsy, although we may touch that, mostly cost-effectiveness of treatment. Stephen and Louise are here with me as well. After 5 straight sessions, Donna needed to go back to her day job at Global Liver Institute, and we hope to see her soon. Mazen, you and I were talking about this before we got started. As often as you've been on the podcast, I think it's 3-4 times by now, I don't recall that we've ever asked you to introduce yourself formally to our listeners. So let's do that today. Please take a couple of minutes, share some of your story, your work, how you came to love what you do, areas of interest. And in the end, one fact our listeners would never know about you if you didn't tell them. So why don't you kick us off?
Well, thanks, Roger. I don't have much to say. Maybe I should defend my IT story first, that I'm not the only one who had IT struggle. So I'm a hepatologist in Los Angeles at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. I'm originally from the Middle East, from Syria. I came here. I did my residency at USC. Then I went to National Institute of Health to do liver fellowship. Now we say where Dr. Fauci is. Went back to UCSD and the GI fellowship, then closed the circle at USC. And I started probably the first fatty liver program in Los Angeles. There were some efforts, but we took it seriously. Everyone was doing hepatitis C then. And then Cedars-Sinai wanted to start a fatty liver program, and I moved here and I started the program here. I do research on NAFLD, different aspects, and mostly focused on biomarkers and therapies. The dean of therapies is on this episode, Steve Harrison. And I also try to answer questions that are related to the natural history that I feel like it's going to make a difference. Facts about me that you don't know. All right. So my father actually is a gastroenterologist, and he was trained in England. That's why I have a lot of love for the English people. And we argue the systems, the US versus the British. I decided not to listen to him and go to England. I decided to come to the US to do my training, just not to listen to my dad. So we always have these debates. I have a brother who is going to be trained in gastroenterology and specifically in hepatology at UCSD. So we are a GI family. Some people make fun of us in a different terms, so I don't want to say those on the broadcast. Another fun fact of me that you will never guess, that for those who knows me, they know that I should jog more and watch my diet, but I actually played basketball professionally overseas. And then when I was 18, my dad looked at me, he's like, you inherited my genes, you're not gonna grow, quit basketball and go do medicine. So sometimes now, when I go to play pick up basketball or something, people are like, okay, we'll let you in. And then they get a little bit surprised when I start playing. Not that I have played in the last 3-4 years, but I got that here and there.
So I think that, along with Naeem Al-Khouri's playing the out, would be at the top of all the surprises that we've gotten from people. I think that's actually pretty good. You were too modest when you said you had nothing to say.
He's a LeBron of hepatology. The Michael Jordan of gastroenterology.
I'm kind of thinking more like Steph Curry, right? I'm picturing this short guy burying threes from all over the court.
It was just the past. It was. I used to be good in that country at my age. That was the extent of it.
I like Stephen's vision of you being Michael Jordan and soaring over the entire hepatology community to dunk on them all at once.
Every time I introduce him now, the LeBron of LA.
I will take Michael because I used to be in love with that guy and watched all his games, to be honest. And one fact, actually, I heard he can be a little bit mean. And I learned that like maybe 20 years after he stops. And I was so sad, like he was mean and all that. But I think he's a brilliant player. And I watched every single game for that guy.
Why don't we just go on to the typical icebreaker? Stephen, yours can be how you're going to introduce Mazen in the future if you so choose. One good thing, personal or professional, that happened in the past week. I'll go first. I got my second Pfizer vaccine on Saturday and slept it off a bit of the weekend, and I'm now good as new again and fully vaccinated. So I'll take that.
All right. The most eventful event I had last week during the NASH tag and around, unfortunately, my dad broke his nose, so I didn't fall to watch the full NASH tag, and I ended up in the hospital with surgery. But I'm not trying to tell you a sad story. He's well, he's recovering, and life is good. Look at the glass half full.
I don't know if I said this on the last podcast, that prevalence paper actually has now been accepted at JHEP and is online ready. So only the second paper ever published describing NASH prevalence by prospective liver biopsy in a middle-aged cohort of Americans. So very, very pleased to get that one out. That was about an 8-year project. We enrolled over 800 patients. So I think that'll be a good addition to the literature for epidemiology.
You had mentioned it briefly, but you get a second whack at it because there was a lot more detail in that description. And that sounds fantastic. Very, very exciting.
I didn't have anything really, except I had a major fish tank emergency and a couple of 100 litres of water all over my floor. But I managed to rescue my fish. Whether or not that's long going, well, I try and rescue the tank. That's a different matter. But so the fact that my fish are still alive is my positive of the week. But I have a very wet floor for a while.
Well, that's pretty brilliant. I forget, did you tell people last week about where you were staying while you were doing the episode after having been at the Excel Center?
I was on the Sunborn yacht because, of course, when I do my NHS work, I'm based at the Excel Center. And to get across to do the podcast means I've got to stay somewhere local. So I stay on a 150-foot yacht. I'd like to say that one day I might win the lotto and have a 150-foot yacht, but it was very pleasant. It's a nice advantage that they're offering to the staff at the Excel. The Nightingale closed last week, and we're increasing our numbers of vaccine patients, which is excellent news.
Fantastic. And I will endeavor to post the photo that Louise shared with her fellow surfers of what the yacht looks like from the outside. It's a kind of a dare to dream moment for us all. All right. So with that, let's go on to the episode. Mazen's done a lot of work in a lot of different areas, but I think the one to focus on today for a variety of reasons is going to be cost effectiveness of therapy. It's actually of the whole paradigm in terms of therapies, in terms of testing, in terms of the whole array of issues. Take about 5 minutes, dive in wherever you want, 5 or 6 minutes, and walk us through some thinking that you want to share with our audience about that.
Sure. Let me take a little bit background story, and I want to be reminded that I have to give the right credit to the right people. So I was quite taken back with the AASLD guidelines that did not recommend screening in high-risk population. Nevertheless, I'm not faulting them. They based their decision on data versus, I think the EASL at that time took a step forward and said we were going to screen, although we don't have a cost-effective analysis data. So they were both right. There was not cost-effective analysis data showing that screening is cost-effective, but EASL took a different road and said, despite that, we will until we get the cost-effectiveness data. So I took it as a mission. We all start from patient's perspective, and we see a lot of these patients that they get NASH, and I'm in a transplant center. I have my craziest story was when I got a guy who within a month, he learned, it's actually less than a month, 2-3 weeks, in his late 40s, early 50s, was diagnosed with NASH cirrhosis, HCC, and a tumor clot extending all the way to his right atrium. We transferred him here. We didn't know about that tumor clot. We found it here, and he unfortunately passed away within a month. So many of us have different stories and passion about discovering the disease, screening for it, finding treatments and correct therapies. So I took it as a the project, and I have to give the credit to a lot of people. One of them is the second author on the paper, Colm Jones, who is actually a health economist based in England, that NASHnet actually funded the project. We reached out to him to build the Markov model that it took us a year and a half to build, despite published literature, and find all the right dollar sign and how much this cost and how much this test is sensitive. The credit will go to the rest of the co-authors, especially Dr. Dietrich and my last author, Merrill Ranella, who's a good friend to all of us. We started the project and we built the Markov model. And another credit should go to Zubair Younasi, who you all know, you all read his papers, but he started publishing Markov model in terms of disease transition, multiple papers. And in addition, he published cost data. There's 2016 hepatology paper, 2019 hepatology paper, that the cost can be in the 200 billions. So our concept was simple. We went back to the AASLD and they relied on previous cost-effective analysis data. And I think it was excellent at that time. That cost-effective analysis showed no cost-effectiveness. The reason why, they said, well, let's take the patients with type 2 diabetes, age more than 50, and randomize them in the model to treatment versus no treatment. They get a biopsy. If they have NASH, they get pioglitazone. Well, guess what? Pioglitazone is effective, but they didn't show quite a bit strong data in terms of fibrosis reversal. What happened after that paper, there were tons of data came out in terms of fibrosis and its importance in disease, comorbidity, and mortality. So the F2 and higher data came out, and that was after that cost-effective analysis. FDA took another route that NASH with F2 is the targeted population. Then also the non-invasive testing starting being developed and having better footprint. And also the cost of liver transplant and HCC and decomp NASH was not taken quite in consideration in that paper. Again, multiple data came out. So because of others, people work in the field, we felt we can put this model together. And I will summarize it in the, I guess, remaining minute. So we said we'll take, based on Zubair Younasi's model, people with type 2 diabetes, age 55 and higher, and we'll screen them for fatty liver. Of course, in these models, you randomize to treatment versus no treatment. I'll tell you what's the treatment in a second. But we said also, we're going to stage them so they receive treatment. So we started the model with ultrasound with ALT, or ultrasound with AST, or ultrasound alone. The reason we took ALT and AST, we just wanted to see the effect of elevated liver enzyme, especially AST has a role in staging. But we took ultrasound also alone. Then if the patient was found to have fatty liver, we said, we chose transient elastography to detect the disease early at F2, and those are the targeted population for the treatment. I'll stop here for a second and say we took in consideration a lot of things: sensitivity, specificity of the test, FibroScan, the biopsy, ultrasound, you name it. And they were like true negative, true positive, false negative, false positive. So all the economical analysis. Of course, some people got the ultrasound followed by FibroScan, or people called ultrasound by liver biopsy. And then they went either no treatment or intensive lifestyle intervention. And that lifestyle intervention is very important because it's not the usual one recommended for diabetics. It's based on Villar-Gomez data that was done in NASH, and it's a little bit more extensive than the regular diabetes care. They have like one-on-one person meeting and then the group meeting, so it's kind of behavioral therapy. There's cut on the diet. Anyways, to make the story short and open it for the discussion, we sure found that if you find fatty liver and you do biopsy to look for F2, nothing was cost effective. If you do ultrasound with without liver enzymes, then you find the F2 patients and then you randomize them to intensive lifestyle intervention. And we did only 12-month cycle. So we were conservative. We didn't say we're going to go beyond that. It was cost effective, and the non-invasive testing, liver biopsy, was not cost effective. So that's how we approached it. We then changed it to age 40. Age 40 was cost effective if you went down as well. And we looked at the pioglitazone and maybe indirect data in its reversal of fibrosis, and that was cost effective as well. So in that paper, we end up recommending that hopefully AASLD will change their guidelines for further recommendation recommendation of screening type 2 diabetes patient for NAFLD.
I thought your work was excellent, and I think it was great to see that in that population specifically that we've now got proof of cost effectivity. And I think certainly recently there's been a lot more said about liver disease and particularly liver cancer in the type 2 diabetic population, certainly in the UK, that it's now one of the leading causes of death in this population. So anything that goes to target a population where we know we're going to find a significant number of people whose lives that we can save. And now we have proof and data. So excellent work.
I'll echo Louise's comments. I think this is really a very nice body of work that opens a lot of eyes towards this population, and I think gives a lot of credence to screening the diabetic. That when I was part of the practice guidance document that Mazen was referring to, where we did not include this guidance to screen diabetics for fatty liver. And remember, the guidance document is really predicated on a data-driven principle. And so when we don't have data, it's hard to make strong recommendations. So I think it's under revision again. I'm not part of the writing committee this time around, although I'm part of the review committee. I would very much like to see this incorporated into the guidance document. I think it was well done. It was collaborative and pulled out a lot of the salient points that we look for in our screening today. I do have two questions for you, Mazen. Number one, how would you expand on your work if you continued to look at this? What would be kind of additional parameters that you would want to look at? Would you look at it over a longer period of time? Would you broaden it out to additional phenotypes of patients? What's next? You could build a career off this sort of thing. Where would you go next with modeling?
Oh my God, you asked me the question that I want to talk about next. We moved actually this effort toward looking at the rest of the world, including the US, and I'll tell you what is changing a little bit. So we have reached to our European colleagues, and I want to mention recent publication in Liver International by Yoon Schwedenberg and Vlad Radzu as the last author and first author, and they published European data on the cost of NASH in European countries. It's not cost-effective analysis, it's cost analysis and how costly is this disease. So we have a collaborative effort going in 5 European countries in addition to the US to look at cost effectiveness around the world. We don't have Asia yet, but that's another area to go for. We also want to include in the future, in addition to intensive lifestyle intervention, I remind you, fibrosis is, we thought it's the most effective outcome, especially it correlates with clinical events. But now we're seeing more and more data that NASH reversal leads to fibrosis improvement, thus you can make indirect relationships. So in this new work, in addition to intensive lifestyle intervention, we will include some of the promising drugs that we think that they will likely get approved. Now, the question is if they will be cost effective for screening. There's screening and there's treatment. So there are two different things. They can be cost effective for treatment, not for screening. So that's the next step, I think, Stephen, to answer your question correctly. Look at the European countries, include more treatments, and keep updating the model as we get more data, because the model is already built. We built a foundation for the last year and a half, and now we can just make new data or come up with a new data based on new treatments and their costs and yada yada.
Can I just ask, the cost effectivity data and the cost analysis is all pre-COVID. We've obviously had a significant impact potentially with NASH patients and NAFLD patients driving COVID, which has been massively costly to the entire globe. Is there a way to try and work out the effect of fatty liver disease on that cost overall?
That's excellent point, Louise. I think eventually we'll be able to, is just we need to see more data in terms of the cost of COVID in certain population, and then you look at cost effectiveness. Because as I told you, like the substance of our work came from a lot of literature that Zubair and some some work like Schattenberg that they have done detailing the cost of every single thing. So we need more data to have a good understanding how COVID affected NASH, although we are already seeing many of them, like the weight gain, not being enrolled to trials. This is a very complex relationship, but it's a very interesting one to look at.
There was a fair bit of data coming out of China in how many patients got to ITU with fatty liver disease it drove. And in some cases, 93% of those sitting in ITU were fatty liver patients. Now, the cost of ITU care is extremely costly. So I suppose there is the potential to look back at some of the data that is starting to come out more and more. But I think we've all recognised that keeping well and being healthier is actually the most cost-effective strategy for any healthcare industry, I suppose.
Indeed.
Louise, thanks for that. One of the things I was going to note is that it looks like the relationship between COVID and NAFLD and NASH goes in both directions, right? COVID has an effect on the liver, but the condition of liver disease at the time of COVID diagnosis, particularly when coupled with obesity, appears to be predictive of outcome. So how does a model play both ends of that at once, I guess would be my first question.
I'm sure you have seen tons of Markov models. This is part of giving a credit for other people that they are the specialists. So this is something I would need a health economist to help us with, looking at the bidirectional relationship that you mentioned and compare it to the previous condition. You have also to take in consideration that we all hope that this is not going to persist and it will improve with time. And this time factor and when it's going to go away that we all hope for, or some of it will still stick around, but with better outcomes, it's a lot of unknowns. So that's like a major modeling from health economical standpoint.
Do me one more favor. People who listen to this podcast are really diverse in terms of profession, level of sophistication, and frankly, where in the world they live. It might be a good thing just to take a minute and walk people through at a high level, if it's possible to do that, what makes Markov models the right way to do this and what makes those models work well. And then the second thing that might be helpful is to explain the relationship between cost and cost effectiveness. If you know the cost effectiveness, what does that tell you when you see cost data or vice versa?
Sure. So the Markov model, what makes it successful is good natural history data, and you need to know about disease transition and put the data well together. So in our model, we move from NAFLD to NASH to F0, F1, F2, and F3 and F4. So you need to know how many people progress or regress in the natural history, eventually how many people get to HCC, how many people decompensate, how many people get to cirrhosis. For instance, let's take the cirrhotics. You need to know how many of them stay in the cirrhosis status within that 1 year that you randomize your patient. You need to know how many go to HCC. You need to know how many get transplanted. And you need to know if there's any improvement, how many they improve. So you will see it as a tree going right and left with a lot of natural history data. So that's how, if it's the successful model is built on careful and expertise and careful review of the data. Sometimes there's conflicting results, so you have to come to the resolution. Let's talk now about cost and cost effectiveness. The cost is, as it sounds, how much this is costing me. So I'll give you an example in our data. So if I remember correctly, NASH with decompensated cirrhosis and HCC cost about $94,000 within that year. If there was NASH and HCC without decompensation, again, decompensation was HCC was 94, without decompensation was 34,000. And then the transplants, the best data we came out from US was between private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid was about 350,000. So this is cost. It's a number. Then you have to take this number and test your hypothesis, meaning, okay, I'm going to spend money on ultrasound, I'm going to spend money on ALT, and I want to check if I spend money on FibroScan or biopsy, which strategy, if I discover the disease early and treat it, will save me from going to more expensive status. So it's the cost effectiveness is way more complicated than just cost. And it tells you if the screening will prove to be economically saving you and the system.
The importance of work like this is that it shapes the decisions that people make going forward in terms of guidelines and then in terms of who gets treated and at what level. How do you see see the work evolving over time? And based on what you've seen so far, how do you see therapeutic decision points and modalities evolving over time? A, before we get drugs, and then B, as we get drugs.
Yeah, so I mentioned screening and I mentioned treatment. The government agencies, the insurers and all that, when they approve drug or screening procedure, they're going to look for cost effectiveness. I mean, of course, patients' well-being and saving transplants and all that, it's our priority. But also the government agency and insurance wants to make sure, for instance, the pharmaceutical companies are not charging more than the drug worth. So based on like a lot of cost effectiveness models, let's say, I'll just give an example of drug X. Drug X say, I'm going to target the F3 population for this amount of dollars per month, and this is my drug cost. So once we have drugs approvals, the government agencies and the insurers will sit down and say, this drug, I'm just throwing a number, I'm not suggesting anything, $1,000 a month, you're probably going to use it for 3 years. We still don't know if it's going to be used forever, like the diabetes drug, but I'm just giving random examples. $1,000 a month, now $36,000. Is it the right, do we have the right population F3? How much is going to save us? Of course, I mean, here it sounds like F3 patients use $1,000 a month. It likely will be cost effective, but they will be looking at, in addition to the screening we did, if these drugs are cost effective and which right population they're going to use it on, especially those with advanced fibrosis. There's quite increase in hazard ratios and odds ratios of morbidities and mortalities, especially when you reach F3s. So the biggest question will be when we get to therapies, the drug price and what is the right population to treat F3s and F2s based on drug price. Of course, all of us want to start early at F2s, but there will be a lot of modelings, even if it's not published. A lot of insurance companies and government agencies do that. So I guess to answer your question, in addition to looking at screening cost effectiveness, the next step in the cost effectiveness in the field will be probably looking at the potential approved drugs and the duration of their use and if they will be cost effective for the system.
So moving on from that, in the context of health screening and the sort of health insurers, Alina Allen and a team did a lovely piece of work a couple of years back where they looked at 100 million customers and they reviewed them, and I think they split them 152,000 approximately with NAFLD, and they showed that the average annual cost of a new NAFLD diagnosis was $7,000, so anywhere between $3,000 and $18,000, but the long-term management was $3,789 against a match control of $2,298 for somebody without NAFLD. So where do you suspect it becomes cost effective to do a FIB4, an AST-ALT ratio, or a FibroScan on a lot of patients to try and work out who's going to be those costs? Is it earlier in the timeline? Would it be later? Because we know these people keep presenting to GPs undiagnosed for a long time.
So before I comment on the FIB4, let me just comment on the NASH cost. So the NASH cost, I just want to bring it to your attention that this is probably on the lower scale of cost because, as you know, NASH can be broken down into those with F2, F3, F4, and cirrhotics are way more costly, and those with HCC are more costly. And of course, the most costly one is the liver transplant or long ICU admission and death. So the cost can be, from what you said, it can be fractionated into way more cost. Your question of FIB4 is right on. We were actually asked by the gastroenterology journal reviewers about FIB4. And the reviewers we got, I could not ask for better. They were very constructive. Rarely happens from 3 reviewers, but the 3 were just right on. We wrote about 16 pages of reply, but all great points, and I think it improved the analysis. And one of the things that we addressed in the paper briefly, because they asked us to, rightfully so, what do you think of FIB4 and NAFLD fibrosis score? To answer your question directly, I think FIB4 is a cheap test that will always be cost effective to screen. And we expected that from our data. And we told them we did not calculate it based on FIB4 and NAFLD fibrosis score because basically we wanted to start a little bit earlier. As you know, NAFLD fibrosis score and FIB4, they usually differentiate advanced fibrosis or no advanced fibrosis, and you have the gray zone area. So we said if you take the 2.67, for us is a little bit too late, and we wanted to capture patients early. But if you use the FIB4 as of today, it will be cost effective for our model for sure, even if I don't put the number in the calculator. There's a way also around that. You can use another cutoff for FIB4, lower than 2.67. Hopefully it will include more F2s. That will require looking at the data more carefully and how sensitive it is for F2 in specific and yada yada. But the cost, I think, will be super cheap. So yes, if you are advocating for FIB4 to be used for screening, I will say screen and use whatever cheap tool that is good and you think it's going to help your patient.
Mazen, just thinking a little bit more about liver cancer and the fact that it in fatty liver behaves maybe more like hepatitis B than it does like hepatitis C, where very often we have to go through this cirrhotic paradigm to get to liver cancer in the setting of hepatitis C. And in fatty liver, we see that it can pop up randomly with, NASH with milder forms of fibrosis and even reported cases of NAFLD leading straight to liver cancer. It tends to be population specific. I know Rohit presented some nice data at NASH looking at genetic variants influencing this as well. But how do you see this conundrum of liver cancer popping up randomly without any clear demographic speculation on our part as primary care or GI docs in identifying the at-risk liver cancer patient? How does that play into your modeling, and does it change the Markov model? Do you have to make some assumptions there, I assume?
Well, we actually used published data on that. Of course, there was not quite enough data that we wished for. So most of the HCC was heavy on the extreme side of the disease. We did take that in consideration that HCC can, pop up in earlier stages, but I wish we have more data. But just to your question, actually, while you were asking me this question, it came to mind if we should do a separate project, which is the following. As you know, for hepatitis B, there are recommendations for screening for non-cirrhotics or HCC, and especially in Asian population, there's the Africans as well, and there's age cutoff for each one. And of course, that was all based on cost-effective analysis data and modeling. So you just stimulated a conversation if we should look for when to start screening for NAFLD and HCC even before cirrhosis. I think Rohit and Hashim and Saraj put some guidance, a little bit provocative, but kind of predictive the future screening of HCC. But I think cost-effective data will be quite helpful. So that's a very important question you asked, Stephen.
That is a great next step for you to really dive into that a little bit more and see if there are specific subsets that we should be focusing on. Again, like I said, you could take this as foundational and spend an entire career on this. And you do so many other things well, it's going to be hard to figure out where you want to devote your time and effort and energy at the same time of being a dad to two little girls, right?
One and -1.
Well, one on the way.
Yes. And for this project, I think we should move to look for these when to screen for HCC, and you will sure get a credit and we'll get you involved if we start that.
Congratulations, Stephen. One more benefit of participating in this podcast. Stephen doesn't need credits, but every credit helps. I get that part.
Yeah, but it's always good to give people back their ideas and get them involved. And of course, like with Stephen, we'll get way more input and beneficial input.
So question, from your work, we start introducing, hopefully, screening diabetes. How do you, as an endocrinologist, have that conversation with your patient that says, we are now going to start screening you for fatty liver disease because you have a considerable risk of liver cancer, fibrosis, and you might have a risk of liver transplantation. And the patient turns around and says, well, why haven't you done that before? Oh, we've now decided it's cost effective to do that. That wouldn't make me feel particularly comfortable as a patient saying, so you've known that there's a risk, but it hasn't been cost effective until now. How do you think that conversation is going to go? Because that's an awful lot of people we are now recommending getting screened, that a lot of people for a long time have said should be screened.
Well, I mean, this is the nature of science and evolving data. As you know, I'll give you an example of the colon cancer screening. These data has changed over time. And now, based on your data, we are changing screening to age of 45 rather than 50. So it's the nature of the beast, I guess. A lot of patients would not know what is the term cost effective. So I would imagine a lot of endocrinologists will be saying, we have a new data that this disease is serious. disease. And now our societies hopefully are recommended screening for it, while before the societies did not recommend screening for it. And the societies are always the umbrella or the source that change things. So it can be addressed in the right term, in the right way, and basically based on society's data.
Louise, listening to your question, I think I agree with Mazen that if what happens is a society changes its recommendation, then the packaging to the patient or the discussion to the patient winds up being about the new recommendation from the society, not about the fact that it's based on cost effectiveness. My guess is some patients might drill into that, but most won't. And I've spent enough time interviewing patients on the way out of a doctor's office about what do they remember and what were they thinking about at that moment. You have to remember that half of the content of the average conversation is lost to the patient, because mostly what they're doing is hearing about the new recommendation and what it portends about their health. So I would be worried if that was the conversation everybody was going to have over and over again, but I don't, in practical terms, I don't envision it. Frankly, we've looked at this in enough countries.
So I want to remind you of also, we tried also to model metabolic syndrome. Was not easy to do because the data was a little bit less clear, and we don't want to include controversial data. The type 2 diabetes data were very clear. And the nice thing about type 2 diabetes is that they have already pathways. They check for retina, they check for heart, they check for this and that. For this paper, we're not asking to screen everyone. We're recommending starting at the age of 40. Sure, you will miss some patients, but from cost effectiveness and practicality, you're going to start looking at these adults age of 40 with type 2 diabetes, and it can be built easily into their health maintenance kind of checklist. Indeed, just imagine that we're all now with Epic, that the type 2 diabetes patients know the pop-up that we use or the formula that will just spit out FIB4 for you before they leave. And even like you can have FIB4 interpretation with it. So that's not which will trigger referral or not. So things like this we're thinking of. There have been multiple papers in how to formulate that in primary care and endo. But as said earlier, the society guidelines should give credibility to these proven data before anyone starts.
Oh, yeah, I'm just being devil's advocate on those ones.
Absolutely.
Then let me take this in a different direction that may or may not be devil's advocate, but it's certainly kind of thorny. Based on everything you've been looking at on cost and cost effectiveness related to screening and an understanding of how insurance companies are likely to operate in the States, what is the list price of an agent at which you suspect sirens will go off? And if you don't want to answer that question, I'll give you a couple of hypotheses and you can say yes, no, maybe so.
So you can do actually decision trees, meaning you can have prices and you can ask yourself, again, there are multiple areas. For instance, let's say drug S. I'm giving you an example. So is it effective for screening for a price of $2,000 a month? That needs to be modeled. I would imagine probably not. But this drug S can also be, on the other hand, if the disease already discovered, meaning you're not spending money on screening, is it effective in treating NASH and F3, for instance? So those are different questions with different price tag. And health economists will answer this in more sophisticated and better detail, but this is the idea. We try to build decision trees on the price target for screening, and I can tell you it's probably not going to be an expensive drug that will help us get to the screening. And that's why intensive life intervention turned to be cost effective. I'll tell you what's the cost of intensive life intervention was these meetings and, dietitian, all that. It was about $2,900 within that 12 months with all these visits and interventions. I don't remember the highest price that we got to and was not cost effective. We modeled a certain drug based on future prediction of its price, and it was not cost effective. But again, we're predicting what they're going to price their medication. So it's unfair game for now.
The day I met Stephen, I was on a stage telling 180 total strangers that the prices that I was hearing people flying around for their F2 NASH drugs made no sense to me. And they were in the $1,500 to $2,000 a month range was what I was hearing. And I said, I don't know very much about this disease, but if the population estimates I'm looking at are even close to right, for anybody in F2 or even early F2, maybe even F1, some people fantasize, those numbers don't sound like they're going to add up.
Actually, I think it's more complicated than this, and I'm interested in Stephen's opinion as well. So it is not just it's too expensive for NASH F2. The question is it going to be like diabetes? I'm going to use it forever? Or is it going to be, well, I have a patient with NASH F2. I'm going to use the number used, $2,000 a month. And all I need is a couple of years to reverse it from F2 to F1 or F2 to F0 in 3 years. I'm just throwing random examples. And then I'll switch them back to weight loss and exercise or have another cheaper drug. So there are a lot of factors that play a role in this decision. Duration, which F you're going to stop, if there are cheaper drugs that you can continue with. What do you think, Stephen? This is very crystal ball, I guess, kind of area that people needs to predict.
Well, we like to go where no one's gone before. So, Stephen, go ahead.
This could be a whole nother discussion in and of itself, but just kind of the way I see this landscape shaping up is I divide NASH into F1, F2, then F3, F4, and I overlay that with comorbidities that the patient might have. So heart disease, kidney disease, both, diabetes, do they need glycemic control as well as atherogenic lipid control? And then I look at oral therapy versus injectable therapy. So when we look at injectables, we got the GLP-1s, the FGF19s, and the 21s. They all move fat in a very rapid and sustainable way. There's really positive impacts on the histopathologic parameters, even as early as 12 and 16 weeks. But they all come with some degree of GI tolerability issues. So I think they're going to be targeted more toward the F3, F4 population, whereas the orals that are safe, well tolerated once daily, like icosapent, for instance, or resmetirom. Those will be targeted as more long-term therapy. So you could envision a situation where, the juice is worth the squeeze. Let's use the injectable. Let's slow the freight train down from heading toward the edge of the cliff. Let's back them up a little bit, treat them for 6 months, 9 months, then transition them over to an oral that's safe, well tolerated with no adverse events, that has a favorable atherogenic lipid profile, like a resmetirom, or maybe some additional glycemic control benefit, like a structurally engineered fatty acid, for instance. And there are other therapies. This isn't a comprehensive discussion on how we manage these people, but then there's combination therapy, right? So I think there's a lot of ways to play it. But to me, if I have a cirrhotic in clinic, that's well compensated, or an advanced F3, I'm going to want to try to treat them relatively aggressively and then maybe switch them over to something for the long road, like a diabetic or a hypertensive or a hyperlipidemic patient.
The thought behind my question, which I think you touched on, and Stephen certainly touched on, is this is all going to get a lot more complicated. I didn't say that you couldn't charge $2,000 a month for a NASH drug. I said that if you plan to have lifetime therapy with F2 patients, that might not work.
You're right, yes.
I'm right where you are on that. The other thought I've got, and I used to model this from the other side for drug companies and occasionally for insurers, is that the insurers will be advised by everybody they know, and they're not going to need a lot of advice on this, to take an extremely conservative position on how many people are going to be able to discontinue or step down to a much cheaper drug, how quickly. Because what they're always looking for is where on the slippery slope you have exposure that you can't control.
You're right on. We already actually, with the insurance companies, many of us have had conversations. And I think we saw the first wave, like, holy cow, there's 80 million people, that they're going to be 100 million people in 2030. Which one of those we need to treat? So we had to do a lot of assurance that it's not this entire population. It's the subset. Initially it was NASH, now we're targeting NASH and F2. That lifestyle intervention, prevention still play a role. But you're right, that's a very smart point that they will ask us at one point, when can we stop that, for example, $2,000 drug on F2? And it's for sure it's going to be different from F3 patient. And not to mention the cirrhotics, if something works at the end, difficult population, it might be even longer duration. So it's a fascinating area that I think all of us should continue to focus on patients' good outcome and benefit while we're trying to convince everyone to do the right thing.
Is there an added benefit to the screening? Because yes, you're looking for the NAFLD population and NASH at F3 and above realistically. But when we intervene, certainly with FibroScan, on people who've been admitted for drinking, even if they've only broken an arm and they've been admitted overnight, by just highlighting a poorer liver health alters behaviour. And we know there's a significant number of people with diabetes who drink just to a level that affects their liver. If we are able to, in your screening, screening anybody over the age of 40, I think you said, didn't you? We have the ability then to change behavior without specifically targeting. A lot of people who will just step back and say, I can make an alteration here. I can now see it. I can now find it. So the added cost benefits to people stopping drinking in sort of higher proportion, are those figured into the work you've done, or would they just be currently excessive and better gains, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted a clean NAFLD NASH picture. You bring in an excellent point, though. It might lead to health benefit in other areas like this. I think you're tapping on the area of BASH, which is both alcoholic steatohepatitis and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So you would imagine if we have good data to add to that, the NAFLD by itself was cost effective in diabetics more than 40. So you'll imagine there will be probably additional cost. I can tell you also like one quick point that we were questioned about. They said, well, the diabetics are recommended to follow a lifestyle intervention anyways. So what you're doing here is what is already recommended for type 2 diabetics. And in addition that, you will make them more aware that they may have underlying liver disease and all that, and they will get better. Our intervention, which was that study that improved fibrosis in these patients by 10%, is different what's recommended currently on type 2 diabetics. It's 2 steps beyond that. So you need to apply that to get the benefit as well. But your point is well taken in terms of other hidden benefits. Not to mention, it will probably also improve the type 2 diabetes better.
So first of all, as the country singer Chris Christopherson wrote a long time ago, you're reading Louise's mail. This is a concept that she raises frequently in different contexts, all the benefits of screening people before they even have a problem. And I think you've certainly touched on one of them, which is maybe they won't have the problem that we're screening them for, but as you're saying, they may also not have related problems with their diabetes if they do a good enough job of touching that earlier. So that's a great point. I'm going to want to make that the point on which we go to final question, except to say that, Mazen, I'd love for you to come back sometime in May or June. And what I'd love for us to do is focus on exactly what you started to lay out with Stephen, which is when you visualize the development of drugs and the economics of disease over time and the way different countries and different insurers might look at testing, if we started to get a very hazy vision of what the long-term downstream therapeutic options might look like, not which drugs, but how do people at different points in the disease continuum get treated differently, taking into account economics and what we know about the liver and all that, what would that look like? Because it's a question I get asked frequently, which is if you had to make this up, what would you do? And I kind of start a little bit where Stephen did or where you did, but the complexity is pretty overwhelming pretty quickly.
Indeed. And I think that conversation can be structured by fibrosis stage, by duration, and by drug classes. I do agree with you. It's not easy and it's complex and it might look hazy, predictive in June, but we can take a prediction shot at it.
I think that sounds like a great idea. I very much want to do that. So let's just move on to the last question. If it exists one thing you heard in the last hour that made you think about anything differently, or if that didn't happen, one thing you'd like the audience to think about differently than you believe they do today.
The biggest thing, I just need to be Mazen's broker because he is the guy that's going to address all these questions for us and make it crystal clear on what the pricing should be, who we should screen, what therapies we should use in what order. I mean, the world is your oyster, Mazen, and I thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insight with us today. And Louise, your questions are always spot on and filled with data. So thanks for that.
Stephen, it's 3 team efforts, and thanks to you and many other researchers in this field. But thank you.
You're just reiterating the Michael Jordan of
Even I know who Michael Jordan is.
I'm still going to go with Steph Curry.
I think he really gave me a project. I think Stephen's points that to look for cost-effective screening for HCC and non-cirrhotic NASH can be helpful because, again, I really start this from the patients I have seen. I have seen so many that they came with just HCC without knowing they had fatty liver disease and turned out to be cirrhotics. So no one wants to know that, oh my God, I had something called fatty liver and that led to cancer. And no one told me to screen or even what to do about it. So I think all of us, if we keep, pushing the effort into increasing awareness, looking at the right things, finding the right treatments, moving away from biopsy to NITs, we will make a difference in the next 5 years.
I think the thing that excites me is the fact that we are getting closer to people really taking note and screening a population, and Mazen's work drives that really nicely. So we're starting to get to that area of early identification, giving people opportunities to not die of a disease, aka the example that you gave that was not uncommon, but is a sad story. And they are all early deaths. And that excites me that we can get that out there. We can start to look backwards and backwards and backwards, and it becomes a wellness issue. Nobody needs to die in the future of a disease that takes so long to cause cirrhosis if we can start to screen at a really good time point. But awareness in the diabetes and endocrinology population, I think, will come as a result of this. And there's some excellent endocrinologists and nurse specialists in those areas that can really take hold of this and run with it. So well done, and thank you.
Amen to that. And Mazen, just one more well done from a different direction. I think I gave myself up already when I told you what the next episode should be about. But I think as a society, we've never been terribly sophisticated in terms of figuring out how to begin to introduce first and second pharmacotherapies into existing diseases. You've got people clamoring for, quote, a cure, unquote. And as a result, we tend to rush into things head first, or we hold back from them based on some fairly shaky economics. And we don't contemplate early enough and adequately the totality of what we're going to be doing downstream and how do we want to treat and what does that mean. So on that level, I think I think your work is amazing. Crediting everyone else who needs to be credited, okay? But I think the work is amazing. And I think the questions that you are asking and that hepatology is asking about this forebode much more thoughtful and better treatment for patients once we get to the point where some of these agents we're looking at start coming to market and we have the ability to treat people differentially based on exactly what it is we're trying to do. And we thought about that in advance. Okay, we're going to wrap it up now. We will find a week in June that Mazen can come back in and we can do this next conversation about, okay, what do the complexities look like downstream? But I want to thank both of you and Stephen, who's not with us right now, for really an excellent and thoughtful episode, and Mazen for laying out lots of things that people need to be thinking about more than they might have been in the past in this audience.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks to you, Louise and Stephen, everyone who has been on this podcast for pushing the envelope and keeping this heard and progressed toward the right direction. So extremely helpful, increase awareness. So it's a privilege to be here.
Thanks, and it's our privilege to have you. And Louise, I'll see you next week. Mazen, I'll see you soon. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thanks for joining last week's coverage of NASH 2021. We loved the conference, and we learned some lessons about programming.
Having said goodbye to Stephen and Louise and Mazen, that brings us to the business portion of today's podcast. Thanks to those who listened in to our NASH coverage. As of now, there have been about 1,100 downloads from 25 countries on 6 continents, including 3 new countries we hadn't seen before: Honduras, New Zealand, and Kenya. Frankly, that's slightly fewer downloads than we expected, and we've learned 2 lessons. Number 1 is the paradox of choice, which means if you give people too many options at once, they generally take off, or too often they take none of them. And number 2 is a lot of you folks go looking for things to listen to, new content on weekends, and you find out about that from your podcasters. So number 1, we will never drop more than 1 episode a day again. And number 2, we will make sure to have fresh content for your podcasters to tell you about every weekend as compared to just our advertising.
Sorry if this gets repetitive, but listener numbers keep on growing.
Listener base continues to grow. We went over 11,000 total downloads while recording today's episode, and over 15,000 total page views earlier in the week. With the 3 new countries in the past week, we're now at 75 or 76, depending upon whether you count Puerto Rico as an independent country, which the U.S. tends not to do, except in Olympics, but Google does. I keep thinking we've touched all the countries we're ever going to touch, and then NASH brings 3 new countries to the party. NASH also pulled in a lot of people from different places. Kenya had 5 users for 1 episode. Taiwan had 17 downloads for another, and Canada had 63 for a third. The Taiwan number is 14 higher than we've seen for other episodes from them, and the Canada number is about 40 higher than we've seen for other episodes from them.
We have some truly excellent episodes coming in the next couple of months. Roger will discuss now.
We're now in a position where we can start planning up to 3 months into the future what we're going to be sending you each week. Part of that is because we have more KOLs and academics who want to participate in the podcast, and part of that's because we're covering more events. So let me fill you in briefly on what's ahead. Next week, Ian Rowe will be back to talk about some of what his findings from his work with Richard Parker in Leeds. In the month of April, we have special episodes with Alina Allen talking about using MR elastography to predict prognosis for cirrhotic and non-cirrhotic patients, and Jorn Schott Rottenberg talking about uses of machine learning. We will also have previews and daily episodes from the 4th Global NASH Congress. In May, we'll have the wrap-up for the Global NASH Congress, a preview of International NASH Day, and we'll have other academic papers coming. Can't tell you exactly who yet because we're still negotiating dates. And then in June, we'll have the International NASH Day coverage. We'll have EASL preview and coverage. Mazen will come back to discuss the dynamic future of NASH therapy. And I expect we'll have, if we haven't had this in May, our friend Naeem El-Khoury back to talk about some of his work as well. So we have a lot of exciting stuff ahead, and I think a pretty good mix. So finally, and as always, I want to thank our exceptional team. I want to thank Mike Wilson, who makes this sound good every week. I want to thank Eric Rounds, who has decided this week to hand off some of his weekly duties to Polly Lee. And Eric has done a tremendous job of getting everything organized here, and perfectionist that he is now feels he has it to a point where he can hand it off. Eric, we wouldn't be in this place without you. Thank you so much. Then, my friend Polly, thank you for picking up all that work. It's not like Polly doesn't have a lot on his plate. He right now is going to nursing school and teaching yoga and spending a lot more time than he had been on the podcast. They say give something to a busy person if you want it done right. Well, Polly, you are my busy person right now. I'm confident you'll be great. And then finally, thanks to all our listeners who keep making this worth doing and who send us letters and notes and reviews and all that. One thing you can do to help the podcast, if you are listening on Apple Podcast, could you please give us a 5-star review and then write commentary about what you like about our podcast? It turns out that Apple has their own independent rating system, and they rely on the 5-star reviews and the messages, and also people who tell Apple they want to follow us as signs that we're growing and building a better podcast all the time. You tell us that, please tell them that as well. Okay, and with that, good luck to everybody all week. Enjoy the first week of spring if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. Sorry to see summer end if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. If you're in a U.S. state that is opening up faster than people have been getting vaccinated, be careful. We're seeing upticks in 15 states at least and a slight national uptick in the last day. So, as I say, be careful. Stay safe. Surf on. We'll see you all next week on the podcast with our friend Ian Rowe. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to questions@surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website. Thanks for listening. See you next week with Stephen Harrison, Louise Campbell, and Ian Rowe on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.